Welcome, ghouls. This is the 13th episode of the Shrouded in Darkness podcast, and I'm your true crime-obsessed host, Marlena. Let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about the mysterious death of Massachusetts man Mark Brunelle. Mark was born August 8, 1961, to Linda and Roger Brunelle. Not much is known about his childhood, other than his first 2 years were spent in a foster home. He would later be reunited with his mother and siblings at the age of 2. We know he grew to be a kind man, very outgoing and hardworking. He was also very patriotic. He loved his family, and they equally adored him. Although his marriage ended in divorce, he had 3 children of his own. Sadly, his only son would take his own life in 2013. Mark was a big fan of the outdoors, camping, fishing, hiking. During the summer months, he would stay at a campground, and when it turned cold, he'd stay with family or friends. He hated the idea of wasting money on an expensive rental when he'd rather be saving money for his retirement. During the time of this case, Mark was living in an apartment in Bellingham with a 71-year-old friend named Elizabeth. He lived with her off and on a couple of times throughout his adult life. For income, Mark worked as a concrete masonry. He even had his own company at one point. Family says he was very skilled in his chosen profession. Now, let's look at the timeline we have for this case. On February 11th, 2021, which was a Thursday, Mark tested positive for COVID. This forced him to postpone a trip to Florida, one he took every year with his family. He feared he would cause someone else to get sick, so he quarantined himself to his bedroom. On the 21st of that same month, he still tested positive for COVID. He chose to get out of the house a bit for that day, simply because he started feeling a little better. But then the following day, that Monday, he started feeling bad again. Around this same time, he mentions to his family that he's needing to do some laundry because he didn't have much left that was clean. On February 23rd, a Tuesday, he learned Elizabeth tested positive for COVID. This obviously devastated him. He left shortly after their conversation with a bag of laundry. This would have been around 11 a.m. He didn't take his wallet or his ID. And this would be the last time Mark was seen by family or friends. Something to know is that Mark and his family were very close. They communicated regularly. And remember, he was supposed to have a trip coming up. When his family reached out to him about the rescheduled plans, no one could get a hold of him. He didn't respond to texts, messages, or calls. Mark's nephew lived close to him, so the family asked him to go by and check on him. When he got to the apartment, Elizabeth explained she hadn't seen him since he left to do laundry on that previous Tuesday. She tried texting him, but never heard anything back. The nephew continued searching for him by going to a storage facility he frequented. This was in Woonsocket, which was less than 10 miles from his home, the apartment he was staying at. This is when one of Mark's vehicles was found. Inside his locked vehicle was his cell phone charging. Nothing else was out of place, no signs of foul play. After this, the family started calling local hospitals, shelters, and hotels, but there were no signs of Mark anywhere. They would eventually reach out to the police to file a missing person report. I will say that for the first 48 hours following that initial report, things weren't taken very seriously. Mark was a 59-year-old man that loved the outdoors. He could have easily left on his own accord. Add in the fact there was no indication of foul play, nothing awry. They weren't too concerned. The police do eventually take some action. They're able to use Mark's cell phone to track his last whereabouts. It shows he was in the Blackstone area, which is a few miles away from where his truck was found. It also shows he tried texting or calling a cousin, but the calls didn't come through. The final call Mark made was to his primary physician at 3:30 p.m. This call was made from the storage facility. The call was quick, and we believe the doctor didn't answer. Later, it is confirmed that the doctor never spoke to Mark that day. A few other notes. This storage facility wasn't what we imagine a facility like this to be. There wasn't secured storage units in a fenced-in area. This was more of a truck yard with shipping containers. People were living in tents, working on their cars. The police did ask around to see if anyone saw Mark or had noticed anything strange at the storage facility. One person said he'd heard a loud commotion, and when he looked out, he'd seen Mark talking to someone in a car. At first, the witness said Mark got in the car and left, but he later retracts that statement and said Mark never got in the vehicle. I'm not entirely sure what this was about. It's definitely a red flag, I feel. Something important. They were able to find all of Mark's vehicles. We already know one was at the storage facility. That's where his phone was found. One was also at his residence. And he also owned a motorcycle, and that was inside his storage unit. So it's believed that wherever he went, he would have had to have walked, or someone would have had to take him. In this case, it seems like the family does more investigating than the police. I said before, they called around to places like hospitals and shelters. The family also checked his P.O. box and found a check in it. This check was for some work that Mark had done and something he was waiting on. They did also check his banking account and saw there was nothing strange, no odd transactions. 82 long days pass. Still nothing. Now we're in May of 2021. Kayakers discover a lifeless body in the Blackstone River of Uxbridge, Massachusetts. This is less than 10 miles from that storage facility. The body is identified as Mark Brunelle. The medical examiner's report indicates there was no water in Mark's lungs. He also had multiple lacerations and a broken hyoid bone. For those not familiar, the hyoid bone is in the throat or neck area. When it's broken, that's usually an indication that someone's been strangled. And according to Mark's sister, he had multiple stab wounds in his arm, in his leg. There was even a 3-inch slice along his neck. Yet his death certificate states the manner of death was undetermined. With all of this information, police wanted to rule Mark's death as a suicide. The family refused this. There were too many things that said otherwise. Obviously, the condition that his body was found in, with all the lacerations, the fact that he was found in water, but there was no water in his lungs. But also, Mark genuinely loved life. He loved his family. He had things to look forward to, like the family Florida trip. He'd also planned a trip to Alaska. And yeah, he did battle depression from time to time. He lost his son to suicide. But he also knew how to handle his mental health. He knew when to reach out to someone for support. To this day, as far as the family is concerned, Mark's case has never been solved. Couple of things to note. There are multiple police departments involved in this investigation. This easily could have caused confusion. Massachusetts was involved because that's where Mark lived. Rhode Island was involved because that's where his truck was found. That's the storage facility. Police never pulled or requested video footage from the area. The family even provided a list of businesses that had cameras. And then when the family tried to contact those businesses, the footage had already been filmed over, because too much time had passed. A witness came forward saying she saw Mark, but that was never followed up with. No more details. Something I feel is important goes back to that storage facility. The family hired a private investigator who did some thorough research on that facility and those that frequented it. He checked license plates and found that many of those people had criminal records that included assault. But as a private investigator, he was limited to what he could do. And this is something else the police, I guess, failed to follow up on, because I've not been able to find any further details. One final note from my research. A few weeks prior to his disappearance, Mark caught someone stealing items from his storage unit. So there was a confrontation. He had also been reprimanded by Elizabeth's granddaughter when he had COVID, simply because she was concerned for her grandmother's well-being. But other than these two seemingly insignificant things, Mark didn't have problems with people. He was a well-liked guy. Before wrapping things up and sharing my own thoughts on this case, all the research came from the Vanished podcast, The Sun, MassLive, and Boston 25 News. So, of course, I mentioned the Vanished podcast is one of my sources. This is actually where I first learned about this case. In this episode, they get to talk to the victim's family, those that worked the case. Hearing them, it's heartbreaking, knowing that they never got any real answers. The biggest red flag to me is the condition of the body. Mark had very obvious cuts and a broken neck. These are injuries that just don't easily happen. Plus, being found in the river when there's no signs of drowning kind of makes you think that he had to be deceased before his body ever touched the water. So how did it get there? And how was his body so severely injured? So many lacerations? And it sounds like some of them couldn't have been easily done by himself. And the police just want to say it was suicide. Make it make sense. In cases like this, it can become really upsetting. I'm a strong supporter of the police force and everything, but I know that sometimes it seems like they don't do everything that could have been done. Maybe this is one of those cases. Maybe they could have acted sooner. You know, I said that those first 48 hours, they weren't that concerned. And it sounds like they didn't follow up on all the leads. Maybe that could have been more helpful. Maybe one day the family will have answers. You can do your part by sharing this story. Make sure people get to know what happened to Mark Brunelle, what kind of person he was, how much his family is still hurting. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, you connect with us on social media. We're at shroudedindarknesspodcast, specifically on Instagram and WordPress. We'd love to hear from you. You can share your feedback, your show ideas, and ask your questions. You can catch next week's show, where we'll be diving into the missing case of Bethany Markowski. Until next time, ghouls.